What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a meta-analysis for the current November 2017 format. This is also going to be a meta prediction going into YCS San Diego, which is going to be taking place this upcoming weekend. Now, we have a lot to discuss because as of the current results from this past weekend with regionals, a lot of stuff's been going down. But without further ado, let's get right into that pie chart that you guys know and love. So, as you guys can see, there's been a pretty big shift when it's come to, especially before we had the ban list for November 2017, things have shifted around a lot, but I think stuff's finally been settling down and we can kind of get at least a glimpse of what the meta is going to look like as we move forward into this format. So, starting off with the big deck that's going to be ruling the top, we have SPYRAL. So, SPYRAL's in a really interesting position because it is the most dominant deck in terms of how powerful the deck truly is. If the deck is able to get its main 2-card combo off, meaning just getting 2 Spirals on the board, making double Helix, and going off completely uninterrupted, there is arguably no deck in the entire game that can actually stop that because your opponent's going to have a board amassed of Spiral Sleeper, Trigate Wizard, Firewall Dragons. They're just going to have fucking everything, and you're not going to be able to play through all of that even with your 6-card hand unless you open like the absolutely fucking perfect 6-card hand. And that's the unfortunate thing, but the positive thing is ever since the November 2017 ban list has hit, the deck is more fragile than ever. And honestly, one hand trap can really hinder the deck's ability to go off and actually gives you the opportunity with whatever deck you're playing to be able to start not only to destroy their double Helix and pretty much set up your own board, but to take control of the game in general. Because if you can establish your own forms of disruption that way, then you're going to be in a very advantageous position, because as long as they're not able to combo off and start going into their plethora of link summons, then you're going to be okay. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't open that hand trap and you're going second against Spirals, it's going to be a very, very bad day for you. So that's something you definitely want to consider when it comes to what deck you want to play or how to prepare for that specific matchup. Now, coming up right after SPYRAL, we have Pendulum Magician. Now, Pendulum Magician isn't teetering too far behind SPYRAL because it's still a very dominant deck as well. It's very consistent. What's interesting about Pendulum Magician is that hand traps aren't exactly too particularly effective against it when in comparison to something like SPYRAL, where they are incredibly effective. Take a look at Pendulum Magician. I mean, yeah, Droll and Lockbird can stop a majority of their searches, but for the most part, if they still have that time pendulum graph before the Droll and Lockbird hits, you still have to deal with a time pendulum graph during your turn. So Droll and Lockbird can be somewhat effective, but I would say in comparison to SPYRAL, it's nowhere near as powerful. Ash Blossom's still a good card, but I mean, frankly, Ash Blossom's good against every single deck, so that's not really an argument you can make. Ghost Ogre doesn't really do too much against the deck, although it can be helpful. It's stronger in other matchups. And then Max C, obviously, very similarly to Ash Blossom, Max C is going to put in work. But the interesting thing is, with Pendulum Magician, it's not only able to establish time pendulum graph, but it's also the deck that can probably most consistently go into number 41 Bagooska more than any other deck of the current format. And that's a really big deal, not only for your SPYRAL matchup, but really for any deck in general, because Bagooska is such a big pain in the ass for any single deck to deal with, and really buys the Pendulum player a lot of time, because as long as that card doesn't get outed, it's like you have 2 free turns just to recruit advantage, and you're going to be in a very, very good position. Let's also not forget that Pendulum Magicians are a Pendulum deck, meaning they can take advantage of Pendulum summoning, and they have a lot of very strong and powerful tools at their disposal. They just took first place at a 500 plus person regional in Philadelphia, and the deck is topping left and right, even in this format where SPYRAL is still seemingly the most dominant deck. So remember, even though these are just predictions, these are going off of the top cut representation from these past regionals, more so playing a heavier weight into the larger regionals, as well as the past ARGs as well. Now, the third highest representation deck, especially at the higher tables, and a lot of people would agree with this, is actually going to be Trickstars. Trickstars. Now, Trickstars are another deck that are in a really interesting position because, as I mentioned before with SPYRAL, if you're able to play a lot of hand traps versus SPYRAL, you're going to be in a very good position because you can lock them down and proceed with your own plays on your next turn. And Trickstar is a very interesting deck because the engine for Trickstar itself is so compressed that you don't actually need to run a lot of cards for Trickstars to function in the way that they need to do. You actually have a lot of open deck space when building a deck like Trickstars, meaning you can maximize on your hand trap count and counter a deck like SPYRAL. Now again, you're kind of at that disadvantage where if you're going up against Pendulum Magician, you don't really need all those hand traps, but that's what you have all the extra slots in your deck for, because you can pretty much accommodate cards that are going to be strong for your Pendulum Magician matchup. And as we saw before the November 2017 ban list, Trickstar was actually one of the decks that was able to compete against full power SPYRAL and actually do relatively well in comparison to SPYRAL just absolutely fucking dominating the entire format. So that's kind of led to Trickstar in the current position that it's in, where it's actually able to compete even better now that SPYRAL's been taken down a notch. Now, Trickstar's in a really weird position though, because even though it is very effective, it kind of has the issue that it doesn't exactly have a necessary win condition, because like when you look at SPYRAL, if they achieve double helix and the effect resolves, you basically win. If you look at Pendulum Magician, if they're able to establish something like Baguska or like Time Pendulum Graph plus Time Star or something along those lines, they're basically gonna win. But Trickstar doesn't necessarily have that sort of win condition in that same way, and that's kind of one of the weaknesses of the deck and why people kind of stray away from it, because you still kind of have to play a back and forth with your opponent in order to achieve those victories. But Trickstar has been topping, especially this past weekend at larger regionals, and has been appearing multiple times at the top tables. So if you're going to YCS San Diego or any of the big premier events coming up in the next following weeks, Trickstar is definitely a deck that you need to look out for. So then the interesting thing is we have our big three decks, but then we also have all of these other decks where the format has basically just been blown right open. I mean, we've seen Paleozoic topping, we've seen True Draco topping, fuck, we saw a True Draco Zodiac top. Like, everyone was like under the impression that Zodiac was just absolutely dead, and yet here it comes out of nowhere getting 6th place at a regional. Like, that's absurd! So we see all these other different decks topping, like Infernoid, we have Lightsworn, we have Mermail. There's so much opportunity here for other decks to flourish that it actually gets me really excited, because as you guys know, I'm a very big proponent of diverse formats. Now, diverse formats are a lot of fun because there's so much variety in the decks that can be played. Obviously, there's going to be decks that are better than others. In this instance, it's SPYRAL, Pendulum Magician, and Trickstar, but there's so much room for ingenuity and creativity that it allows some other decks to maybe come out of nowhere and be the dark horse of the format. We saw Burning Abyss doing well at ARG a couple weeks back. We saw Invoked decks doing good as well. There's so many different archetypes and ways that decks can be built and structured in this current format that if people can analyze the format and kind of assess certain weaknesses of certain decks, like I've mentioned with SPYRAL, Pendulum Magician, and Trickstar, someone might be able to just come out of nowhere and really take an event by storm. There's also the opportunity for even rogue decks like maybe Magical Musketeers, because this is a deck that, yes, is very reliant on its normal summon, but you have to think going into YCS San Diego, there's two big factors. It's a brand new deck that some people aren't going to be familiar with, so they're not going to know how to play against it, and they're also not going to have the necessary tools to counter the deck in the later stages of a tournament. So this is kind of the instance where people who are unfamiliar with a brand new archetype like this, because it comes out the day before a premier event, can actually sneak under the radar and steal some wins because their opponents are unfamiliar with how these certain decks function. But guys, that's my meta-analysis. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the state of the current meta and how you feel about where the game has shifted. I personally think that we're in a very good state of the game. Again, there's always going to be decks that are at the higher tiers of competitive play. There's always going to be a best deck or best decks, but you have to consider the fact that how many other decks are able to compete in that same format, and I think that's what judges whether or not a format is healthy. So with the way things are looking now, I think it's going to be a lot of fun, but also we're going to have to see what YCS San Diego has has in store. But guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3.